Welcome to the 1 Hour Guide by Neil Nathu. Today, we're going to be diving into something that's super important for like startups, or really anyone who's trying to launch something new. We're going to be looking at Steve Blank's The 4 Steps to the Epiphany
Right.
and kind of why it's been such a game changer for startups.
Yeah.
And the cool thing is Anil Nathu has put together this awesome 1 Hour Guide summary.
Yes.
So it's perfect if you want to get like the core of Blank's wisdom quickly.
Yeah, it's a classic for a reason.
Yeah.
Blank really gets why so many startups fail.
Right.
And it kind of boils down to this. They follow a traditional product development model
Okay.
that just doesn't work in the startup world.
So what's wrong with the traditional way of doing things?
Yeah.
It seems straightforward enough.
Yeah.
Build a product, launch it, and then just watch all the customers roll in, right?
Well, yeah, that's what most people think. But Blank points out a whole bunch of flaws in that thinking.
Yeah.
It's like if you built a luxury car without ever asking if people actually want a luxury car,
Right.
you might spend all this time and money and resources crafting this perfect vehicle,
Yeah.
only to find out that nobody wants it.
Right.
Because they all want like electric scooters or something,
Yeah, okay. I'm starting to see the problem here.
Yeah.
But give us some like solid examples.
Yeah.
What are some of the big mistakes that startups make when they kind of ignore the customer like that?
One of the biggest traps is what Blank calls this obsession with first customership.
Okay.
It's this rush to launch, like get the product out the door
Yeah.
without actually checking if there's a market for it.
Right.
And that brings us to Webvan.
Webvan.
Yeah.
The cautionary tale that keeps on giving.
Exactly.
For those who don't know, this was this online grocery delivery service that burned through like, what, $800 million?
Crazy.
Building this massive infrastructure, before really proving that people even wanted online groceries
Yeah.
at that scale.
Totally. And that's a perfect example of another flaw that Blank highlights, which is premature scaling.
Okay.
Webvan went all in on these massive warehouses, huge fleet of delivery trucks, the whole shebang,
Oh.
before they even knew if their business model worked.
Right.
It's like building a 10-lane highway when you haven't even checked if anyone wants to drive to your town.
Right. Yeah. So ignoring the customer leads to all these different problems.
Exactly.
Obsession with launching first, scaling way too early, and then ultimately what?
The startup death spiral.
Oh, yeah.
This is when the lack of customer demand creates this panic.
Right.
And suddenly startups are throwing more money at sales and marketing,
Yeah.
trying to force this demand that just isn't there.
Right.
And it drains their resources
Yeah.
and often leads to the startup failing.
So, okay, the traditional product development model is clearly like a recipe for disaster,
Yeah,
especially for startups.
for sure.
So what's the alternative? What's the solution?
Well, the 1 Hour Guide by Neil Nathu presents Blank's solution, the customer development model.
Okay.
It's a completely different way of thinking.
It's like flipping the script, right?
Exactly. Instead of starting with a product
Yeah.
and hoping that customers will just magically appear,
Yeah.
you start with the customer
Okay.
and then you kind of build outwards from there.
I love that building outwards from the customer.
Yeah.
So how does this customer development model actually work in practice?
Well, it boils down to 4 main steps.
Okay.
Customer discovery,
Okay.
customer validation, customer creation, and company building.
Okay.
Each step is meant to kind of address the flaws we were just talking about.
Okay, so let's dive into those steps one by one.
Yeah.
First up, customer discovery.
Okay.
What does that entail?
So imagine you're a detective.
Okay.
You don't just assume you know who committed the crime. You gather clues, you interview suspects, you build a case, right?
Yeah.
Customer discovery is kind of like that.
Okay.
You're trying to figure out the real problems that your customers are facing,
Right.
not just the problems that you think they're facing.
It's about getting out of the building and actually talking to people, right?
Exactly.
Not just sitting in a conference room
Totally.
brainstorming.
It's about asking questions,
Yeah.
observing how they behave,
Right.
and really trying to understand their needs and their pain points.
Okay.
Because it's only by understanding your customer that you can build something that they'll actually value.
Right. That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So once you've done that detective work and you have a good understanding of the customer, what comes next?
That's where customer validation comes in.
Okay.
Now you have an idea based on what you learned during customer discovery,
Yeah.
but now it's time to put it to the test.
Okay.
Does it actually solve the problem that you identified?
Right.
Will customers actually pay for this?
Yeah, I like to think of it as kind of a science experiment.
Yeah.
You're not just assuming that your idea is brilliant.
Yeah.
You're gathering evidence
Right.
to see if it actually holds up.
Exactly. And this step is all about minimizing risk.
Okay.
You want to get real-world feedback as early as possible
Right.
to avoid wasting time and money
Yeah.
on a product that nobody wants.
And what if the feedback isn't so positive? You
Yeah.
just scrap the whole thing?
Not necessarily. This is where the iterative nature of the customer development model comes in.
Okay.
Based on what you learned during customer validation,
Yeah.
you might need to tweak your product, adjust your pricing,
Okay.
or even kind of refine who your target market is.
Right. It's all about learning and
Yeah,
adapting.
it's
So we've got customer discovery where we get to know our customers,
Yep.
customer validation where we test our ideas.
Mm-hmm.
What's the next step in this customer-centric journey?
That brings us to customer creation.
Okay.
Now that you have a validated solution,
Yeah.
it's time to start spreading the word and building a buzz.
So this is where the marketing comes in.
Yeah.
It's about generating demand,
Right.
creating a customer base for your product.
Exactly.
But I imagine the strategies that you use here depend a lot on what type of market you're in, right?
Absolutely. And that's a key point that Blank emphasizes.
Okay.
You need to understand whether you're in a crowded pool,
Yeah.
competing in an existing market,
Okay.
or if you're diving into like a brand new ocean,
Right.
creating a market that didn't exist before.
Right.
Your approach is going to be very different depending on that.
Okay. So we've discovered our customers.
Yeah.
We validated our solution.
Yeah.
We've started creating a customer base.
Right.
What's that final piece of the puzzle?
The final step is company building.
Okay.
This is where you go from being a scrappy startup
Yeah.
to like a more mature, sustainable organization.
Okay.
You're building out your team,
Mhm.
establishing processes,
Yeah.
creating infrastructure
Right.
to support long-term growth.
So it's about going from we're just figuring things out
Yeah,
to we're a well-oiled machine.
exactly. And this is why a lot of startups stumble. They try to scale too quickly
Right?
before they have the right foundation in place, and that leads to all sorts of problems.
Right. Remember Webvan?
Exactly, Webvan, the poster child
Yeah.
for what not to do.
So we've covered the 4 steps of the customer development model,
Mm-hmm.
which, by the way, are all laid out beautifully in Anil Nethu's 1-hour guide.
Yeah, it's a great resource.
But this isn't just like some abstract framework, right?
Mhm.
It's about practical takeaways
Right.
that anyone can apply.
Absolutely. And that's one of the things that makes Blank's work so valuable,
Yeah.
especially as summarized in the 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu.
Yeah.
He offers really clear, actionable insights that can make a real difference.
Okay.
Whether you're launching a startup,
Mhm.
leading a project at work, or just trying to be more effective in how you approach new challenges.
Let's talk about some of those key takeaways in more detail then.
Okay.
What are some of the biggest lessons that entrepreneurs and leaders can learn from the 4 steps to the Epiphany,
Yeah.
as highlighted in the 1-hour guide?
Okay.
What were some of the things that really jumped out at you?
Well, one of the most important, and we've already kind of touched on this, is the absolute importance of starting with the customer.
Okay.
Don't build a product because you think it's cool
Yeah.
or because you just love your idea.
Right.
You build a product because you know there's a market for it.
Mhm.
You've gone out,
Yeah.
talked to real people,
Right.
validated that your solution actually meets their needs.
It all comes back to customer discovery, right?
Exactly.
That's the foundation
Foundation.
upon which everything else is built.
And it's not a one-and-done thing either.
Right.
You need to constantly be engaging with your customers, getting
Mhm.
their feedback,
Yeah.
and being willing to adapt based on what you learn.
And that ties into another crucial lesson. Testing your assumptions.
Yes.
Don't just assume, everything.
Right.
Be willing to experiment,
Yeah.
gather data,
Mm-hmm.
and pivot if the evidence suggests you're going in the wrong direction.
Exactly.
It's about embracing the uncertainty
Yeah.
and using it to your advantage.
And remember, pivoting isn't a sign of failure.
Yeah.
It's a sign that you're being agile and responsive.
Right.
I mean, some of the most successful companies out there, think about Slack, Twitter, even Instagram.
Yeah.
They all started with completely different ideas
Wow.
before pivoting to the products that we know and love today.
Right.
They didn't get it right on the first try,
Right.
but they were willing to learn and adapt.
It's inspiring, right?
It is.
It shows that success isn't always a straight line.
Yeah.
There are going to be bumps along the way,
Hmm.
but at how you respond to those bumps
Right.
that determines your ultimate success.
I agree.
And one more takeaway I want to highlight is this idea of building a repeatable sales process.
Yes, this is so crucial.
Okay.
This is something that Blank really emphasizes in the 4 steps to the Epiphany,
Okay.
and it's so important for sustainable growth.
So it's not just about making one-off sales.
Right.
It's about creating a system
Yeah.
that consistently works,
Mm-hmm.
that you can replicate
Yes.
and
correct.
scale as your business grows.
It's about moving away from relying on luck
Right.
or individual heroics
Yeah.
and having a predictable, repeatable way to generate revenue.
So much of this comes down to mindset, isn't you say?
Oh, totally.
It's about being open to new ways of thinking,
Yeah.
being willing to challenge the status quo,
Mm.
and being comfortable with a certain amount of uncertainty.
I completely agree. And that's why I think Blank's work is still so relevant today.
Yeah.
These principles that he outlines in the 4 steps to the Epiphany,
Mm-hmm.
and which Anil Nathu distills so well in the 1 Hour Guide,
Yeah.
are timeless.
Right.
They apply to any business, any industry, any stage of growth.
I think that's a great place to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive.
Okay?
We've laid out the key flaws of the traditional product development model,
Yeah.
and we've introduced the customer development model as this powerful alternative.
Right.
We've also explored some of the biggest takeaways from the 1 Hour Guide,
Mm-hmm.
takeaways that I think can help anyone
Yeah.
who's working on launching something new.
Absolutely.
But there's so much more to uncover, so stay tuned for part 2, where we'll go even deeper into these 4 steps of the customer development model and see how you can apply these principles to your own work.
Sounds good. One of the things that really struck me about the 4 steps to the Epiphany is how Blank emphasizes that the customer development model isn't just for startups.
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, we often hear about this model in the context of, tech startups.
Right.
But it's so much broader than that, isn't it?
It really is, yeah.
Like, these principles can be applied to so many different things.
Absolutely.
So how would someone apply these principles to, say, like a project at work?
Okay, so let's say you're tasked with developing a new training program for your team.
Okay.
Instead of just assuming, what kind of training they need,
Right.
you could actually conduct your own mini customer discovery,
Okay.
Talk to your colleagues, find out what skills they feel like they're lacking,
Yeah.
what challenges they're facing, what format they would find most engaging.
So it's about taking that customer-centric approach
Exactly.
and applying it to any situation where you're trying to create something new
Yeah.
or solve a problem.
It's about replacing assumptions with real insights and data.
Okay.
And that actually ties into another key point that Blank makes,
Okay.
and that Anil Nathu highlights in the 1 Hour Guide,
Yeah.
Understanding Your Market Type.
Right. Blank talks about those 4 different types of markets: existing markets,
Mm-hmm.
new markets,
Mm-hmm.
resegmented markets with a low-cost strategy, and resegmented markets with a niche strategy.
Yeah, it's a mouthful.
Yeah, there's a lot there.
But it's important
Yeah.
because each of those markets requires a different approach.
Okay.
So if you're entering an existing market, you really need to think about how you're going to differentiate yourself from the competition.
Right.
What makes your product or service stand out? How are you going to carve out your own space in a crowded landscape?
Right. Whereas if you're creating a new market,
Yeah,
that's a whole different challenge.
totally different challenge.
Because you're not just competing with existing players.
Right.
You're basically educating your customers about a need that they may not even know they have.
Exactly. It's like when the first smartphone came out,
Yeah.
people didn't even know they needed a device that could do all those things
Right.
until it was right there in front of them.
Yeah, okay, so let's go back to those 4 steps for a second
I
and
think.
talk about the big picture.
Mm-hmm.
But how do these steps actually play out in practice?
Yeah.
Like, let's start with customer discovery.
Okay.
How do you actually go about doing that effectively?
Well, it starts with hypotheses.
Okay.
What do you think you know about your target customer? What problems do you think they have?
Right.
How do you think your solution can help? So it's about getting those initial assumptions down on paper
Yeah.
so you can start testing them.
It's almost like creating a roadmap for your investigation.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then comes the fun part, getting out of the building and talking to real people.
Right.
This could involve customer interviews, focus group surveys,
Yeah.
even just observing people as they interact with your product or service.
So it's about gathering as much information as you can to either validate or invalidate those initial hypotheses.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that this isn't about selling your idea at this stage. It's about listening, asking questions,
Right.
and really trying to understand their needs, their motivations, their pain points.
So I imagine being a good listener is crucial here.
Absolutely essential. You
Yeah.
need to be genuinely curious and open to hearing what people have to say,
Yeah.
even if it contradicts your assumptions.
Right. Okay. So you've done your customer discovery.
Okay.
You've gathered all this valuable feedback.
Yeah.
What happens next?
That's where customer validation comes in.
Right. Yep.
You have an idea, you have some initial feedback,
Yeah.
but now you have to see if your solution actually works in the real world.
Right.
Will people actually pay for this? Will it solve their problem in the way that you thought it would?
So it's about moving beyond the theoretical and getting some real world feedback.
Exactly. And this is where the concept of a minimum viable product, or MVP, comes into play.
Ah, yes, the MVP.
The MVP, everyone loves to talk about it.
Yeah, we hear this term thrown around a lot in the startup world.
Yeah.
But for those who aren't familiar,
Yeah.
could you explain what an MVP is and why it's so important?
Sure. So an MVP is basically a bare bones version of your product
Okay.
that lets you test your key assumptions with real users
Yeah.
as quickly and cheaply as possible.
Okay.
It's about getting something out there,
Yeah.
even if it's not perfect.
Right.
So you can start gathering feedback and iterating.
It's like testing the waters before you jumping headfirst.
Yeah, exactly.
You're not investing all this time and money into building a fully featured product
Right.
before you even know if people want it.
And that feedback you get from your MVP is so valuable.
Okay.
It can help you refine your product, adjust your messaging, even pivot your entire business model if you need to.
It's interesting, this whole idea of pivoting.
Yeah,
It seems like a key part of the customer development model
it is.
is being willing to change course
Yeah.
based on what you learn.
It's not a sign of failure.
Okay.
It's a sign that you're adaptable and responsive to your customers' needs.
Right. Okay, so we've validated our idea.
Okay.
We've maybe made some tweaks based on the feedback. What happens next?
That brings us to customer creation. So
Right.
now you have a solution that, people want.
Yeah.
It's time to start scaling your marketing and sales efforts, to reach a wider audience.
And this is where understanding your market type becomes really important.
It really does, yeah.
Like if you're in a new market, you need to focus on educating your audience
Right.
about the problem your product solves.
Exactly.
So you might use content marketing, public relations, influencer marketing,
All sorts of things.
all these different strategies to get the word out and generate that awareness.
Yeah, exactly.
But if you're in an existing market, your challenge is different.
Totally.
Yeah.
You need to figure out how to stand out from the competition.
Yeah.
Maybe you highlight your unique features, your lower prices, your excellent customer service.
Right. It's about convincing customers to choose you
Yeah.
over all the other options out there.
Exactly. And as you start scaling your customer base, it's also really important to keep track of your key metrics.
Okay, so what kind of metrics are we talking about here?
So Blank talks about things like customer acquisition cost,
Okay.
customer lifetime value, and churn rate.
Okay.
These metrics can help you understand how well you're acquiring customers, how much value they're bringing to your business, and
Right.
how many of them are sticking around.
So it's about using data to make smart decisions about your growth strategy.
Exactly. You don't want to just throw money at marketing and hope for the best.
Right.
You really want to understand what's working, what's not working, and how you can get the most out of your efforts.
Okay, so we've discovered our customers, we've validated our solution, we've created a customer base,
Yep.
and now we're starting to scale. What's that final stage in this journey?
The final stage is company building.
That's-
This is where you go from that scrappy startup
Right.
to a more mature, sustainable organization.
Okay.
You're building out your teams, establishing processes, and putting systems in place to support long-term growth.
So it's about going from we're just figuring things out to we're a well-oiled machine.
Precisely. And this is where a lot of startups stumble.
Oh, really?
Yeah, they try to scale too quickly
Okay.
without having the right foundation in place.
Yeah.
And that can lead to all sorts of problems.
Like what?
Like inefficient operations, high employee turnover,
Okay.
even financial instability.
So how do you avoid those pitfalls then?
Yeah.
What are some of the key things to keep in mind during this company building phase?
Well, one of the most important things is to make sure you have a really strong leadership team.
Okay.
Because as your company grows,
Yeah.
you can't do everything yourself.
Right.
You need to delegate responsibility, empower other leaders to kind of take ownership over their areas.
So it's about transitioning from like a founder-centric model
Yeah.
to a more distributed leadership structure.
Exactly. And this can be a challenge for some founders who
Yes.
are used to having their hands in everything.
Right.
But it's essential for the long-term health of the company.
Another key aspect of company building is establishing those clear processes and systems, right?
Absolutely, as your team grows.
Yeah.
You need to have systems in place for things like hiring, onboarding, communication, decision-making.
Right.
Without clear processes, things can get chaotic really quickly.
And it's not just about creating those processes. It's about making sure that they're documented and scalable.
Exactly. You want to create a system that can grow and evolve
Right.
as your company does.
And let's not forget about company culture.
Oh, yeah. Company culture is so important.
That's such a big part of building a successful and sustainable business.
It really is, and it's something that you have to cultivate intentionally.
Okay.
You want to create an environment where people feel valued, where they feel empowered to take risks and be creative,
Yeah.
and where they feel a sense of ownership over their work.
So it's not just about the bottom line.
No.
It's about creating a place where people actually enjoy coming to work
Right.
and where they feel like they're making a difference.
Exactly. And Blank talks about this in the 4 steps to the Epiphany.
Okay.
He emphasizes how important it is to build a culture
Yeah,
that supports the customer development model,
right.
a culture that embraces experimentation, learning, and adaptation.
So it's not just about implementing a set of processes, it's
Mm.
about creating a mindset, a way of thinking that
Exactly.
kind of permeates the whole organization.
Right, and that's one of the things that makes the customer development model so powerful. It's
Yeah,
not just about tools and techniques.
right.
It's a philosophy that can transform how your whole company operates.
This has been a great overview of those four crucial steps.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, is there anything else in the 1 Hour Guide by Anil Nathu
Mm.
that really stood out to you as being important for someone trying to implement the customer development model?
One thing that really resonated with me was Blank's focus on understanding your metrics.
Okay,
It's not enough to just gather customer feedback.
right.
You need to be tracking those key performance indicators,
hmm
things like customer acquisition cost, customer lifetime value, and churn rate.
So it's about using data to make decisions.
Exactly. It's about understanding what's working, what's not working,
Yeah.
and how you can optimize your efforts to really have an impact.
And I think that ties back to one of the core principles of the customer development model,
Yeah,
this idea of continuous learning and iteration.
absolutely.
It's not about having all the answers up front.
No.
It's about being willing to experiment, gather that feedback, and adjust your course along the way.
I completely agree. And that's something that applies not just to startups,
Right.
but to any organization or individual who's trying to do something new.
Yeah, I think this has been an incredibly valuable exploration of the customer development
It
model.
has.
And I hope our listeners are starting to see
Yeah,
how they can apply these principles to their own work.
me too.
But there's still so much more to discuss.
Yeah, definitely.
So in part 3 of our deep dive, we're going to continue this conversation.
Well,
We'll explore some of the more nuanced aspects of the customer development model.
sounds good.
And talk about some of the common challenges that entrepreneurs and leaders face when they try to implement it.
Okay.
So stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into the customer development model.
Yeah, it's been a great conversation so far.
It has. We've covered a lot. We've
Mhm.
explored those 4 key steps
Right.
and how they kind of address the flaws of that traditional product development.
Exactly.
But now I want to shift gears a little bit
Okay.
and talk about some of the challenges that people often face when they're actually trying to put these principles into practice.
Right.
What are some of the roadblocks that you've seen,
Okay.
and how can people overcome them?
Well, one of the biggest challenges I've seen is just overcoming that initial inertia.
Okay.
It's so easy to get stuck in the planning phase,
Yeah.
endlessly refining your idea, perfecting your pitch.
Right.
But the customer development model is all about action.
Mhm.
It's about getting out of the building and talking to those real customers.
It's about embracing that ready, fire, aim mentality in a way, right?
Exactly. You don't need to have everything figured out
Good.
before you start talking to customers.
Yeah.
In fact, it's often better to just start with a rough idea
Right.
and then let the feedback from customers shape your direction.
I can see how that would be really valuable.
Yeah.
But I imagine it can also be kind of scary for some people,
Oh, for sure.
especially if they're used to that more traditional top-down approach.
Yeah, it requires a real shift in mindset.
Okay.
You have to be comfortable with uncertainty,
Mm-hmm.
with not knowing all the answers up front,
Right.
and you have to be really open to hearing feedback
Yeah.
that might challenge your assumptions.
And that ties into another challenge I've observed,
Okay.
which is dealing with negative feedback.
Oh, yeah.
It's one thing to say you're open to feedback,
Right.
but it's another thing to actually receive it.
Right. Especially when it's not what you were hoping to hear.
Yeah, exactly.
That's something that Blank talks about in the 4 Steps to the Epiphany.
Okay.
And that Anil Nathu highlights in the 1 Hour Guide.
Mm-hmm.
He talks about how important it is to detach yourself from your idea
Okay.
and view that feedback as a gift,
Right.
even if it's painful in the moment.
Yeah, it's about remembering that feedback, even the negative stuff,
Mm-hmm.
is valuable data.
Totally. It helps you see your blind spots, refine your approach,
Yeah.
and ultimately build a better product or service. Yeah, it's about turning that stink of criticism
Yeah.
into fuel for improvement.
I like that.
Yeah.
Another challenge I've seen, and this might sound kind of counterintuitive,
Okay.
is knowing when to stop doing customer discovery.
Oh, yeah.
You can get so caught up in gathering all this feedback
Right.
that you never actually move on to that next stage.
That's a great point. And it's like anything else. There's a balance. You need
Uh-huh.
enough information
Right.
to make good decisions.
Yeah.
But you don't want to get stuck in analysis paralysis.
Right. So how do you know when you've reached that point?
Yeah.
Like, when is it time to shift from customer discovery
Yeah.
to customer validation?
There's no like hard and fast rule.
Yeah.
But I think it comes down to a few things.
Okay.
Do you have a clear understanding of your customers' needs?
Mm.
Have you identified a problem that's actually worth solving?
Okay.
And do you have a solution that you think can address that problem?
Right.
If you can say yes to those questions,
Yeah.
then it might be time to start testing your assumptions in the real world.
Okay, so it's about having enough confidence in your direction
Yeah,
to start gathering that real-world data.
exactly.
And speaking of real-world data, let's talk about the challenge of actually building an MVP.
Okay.
Like, it sounds simple in theory,
Yeah, it does.
but I imagine it can be tough to figure out,
Yeah.
what to include, what to leave out, how to
Totally.
get it in front of customers quickly and effectively.
It definitely requires careful thought.
Okay.
And again, there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Right.
I think the key is to really focus on the core value proposition
Okay.
of your product or your service.
Yeah.
What is the essential problem that you're solving?
Hmm.
What are the minimum features that you need to show that value?
Right.
And how can you get that MVP in front of customers as quickly and cheaply as possible?
So it's about being resourceful,
Yeah,
right?
totally.
Like, you don't need a fancy website
Right.
or a fully featured app
No.
to start getting feedback.
You might start with a simple landing page
Yeah.
or a prototype or even just conversations with potential customers.
Right, exactly. And I think that highlights another important aspect of the customer development model.
Yeah.
It's an iterative process.
It is.
Right, it's not a straight line from idea to launch.
Right. It's messy.
Yeah, there's going to be a lot of back and forth, a lot of learning and adapting along the way.
Exactly. And that can be tough.
Yeah.
For people who are used to that more traditional waterfall approach.
Right, where everything's planned out.
Yeah, where everything's planned out in advance.
In minute detail.
Yeah. But the reality is, in the world we live in today,
Yeah.
being able to pivot and adapt is so important.
It's essential for success.
Yes, yeah.
And I think that's a great point to emphasize,
Mm-hmm.
especially as we're wrapping up our deep dive today.
Mm-hmm.
The customer development model,
Yeah,
it's a really powerful framework,
it is.
but it's not a magic bullet.
Right.
It takes effort. It takes a willingness to challenge your assumptions,
Mm-hmm.
and it takes that commitment to continuous learning and improvement.
That's what makes it so exciting, though, right?
I think so.
It's not rigid. It's not prescriptive. It's
Yeah.
a mindset. It's a way of thinking
Mhm.
that can help you navigate uncertainty,
Yeah.
validate your ideas,
Right.
and build something that people truly value.
I think that's a perfect note to end on.
Yeah, I agree.
We've learned so much today.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
But I hope our listeners are walking away with a better understanding of the customer development model
Yeah,
and how they can use these principles in their own work.
absolutely.
And for those who want to go even deeper, I highly recommend checking out that 1-hour guide by Anil Nathu.
Yeah, it's a fantastic resource.
It is.
It really distills those key takeaways from the 4 steps to the Epiphany
Mhm.
in a really clear, concise, and actionable way.
It's a great way to get a handle on Blank's ideas
Yeah,
and start putting them into practice.
I think so too.
Thank you for joining us today.
It was my pleasure.
Visit the 1-hour guide website for more business insights by Anil Nathu.